Hi there, everyone. My name is Devin Ambrose, and I'm a financial consultant with Cerulean. And today we're going to be talking about the new lease accounting standard and the new functionality with JDE to handle this standard. So as a quick agenda, we're going to go through some general information regarding the standard. We're going to talk about the lessee and some of the new guidelines surrounding the lessee and the functionality within JDE to handle that. We're also going to be talking about the property management module, since that's heavily used in this new accounting standard. And then we're also going to be talking about this JDE Lessee Accounting setup and processing within JDE Edwards. So we've been hearing a lot about this new FASC and IFRS guideline on lessee accounting. And this new global lease management regulation basically requires lessors to adhere to a revenue regulation through straight-line rent. This can be found in the ASC 606 and the IFRS 15. The lessees, they will need to recognize assets and liabilities on the balance sheets for rights and obligations, and this can be found in ASC 842 and IFRS 16. Public companies will need to adhere to this new standard starting on December 15th of 2018, and private companies will need to adhere to the new standard on December 15th of 2019. If you want some more information about JDE and its new lease accounting functionality, you can go to this FAQ located in the PowerPoint. So for the lessee, what's new? Basically, they're going to have to recognize the asset as a right of use asset, and it's going to be amortized over the life of the lease. And then the new lease liability is going to be reduced with lease payments over the life of the lease. There are two classifications for the lessee when they engage in a new lease. And this is a financing lease classification and an operating lease classification. So what's the difference, or how do we classify operating versus a financing lease? For financing leases, if the transfer of ownership of the asset takes place, it would be classified as a financing lease. If there's a lessee option to purchase the asset at the end of the lease, that would be classified as financing. If the lease term for a major part of the remaining life of the asset is in place, then that would be classified as a financing lease. And if the present value of a lease and the payments and residual value are almost all of the fair value of the asset, it would be classified as financing. And if there's no value to the lessor at the end of the lease, it would be classified as financing. And if it doesn't fit any of those criteria, then it would be classified as an operating lease. So for JDE, what does it take to implement this new lease accounting standard? Especially on the lessee side, we would need to use fixed assets, we would need to use the accounts payable module, and we would need to heavily use this real estate management module. So we're going to dive a little bit into this real estate management module. And as a brief overview, basically the real estate management module allows us to streamline the financial and operating process. It gives us also some billing capabilities, and it allows us to manage the lease. And it also gives us some real-time data to be able to access and be able to monitor our lease agreements. To set up the real estate management module and to set up a lease, we would need to set up the constants. We need to set up some AAIs. We need to set up bill codes and billing information. We need to set up the lessee and lessor. We need to set up an asset. We need to set up a unit, also set up a lease, and then we need to create our amortization schedules and create our lease commencement. So we're going to start with the constants. This is in the P1510 application. As you can see in the bottom box, there's a lease classification drop-down option. This will allow us to, essentially when we create a lease, it will allow us to default a lease classification when we're creating the lease. So you can either use finance or operating lease here. And then we have our recently starting to exercise the purchase option of a lease checkbox. And then we also have, if we want to generate a unit asset checkbox, and then to activate this new balance sheet accounting for the standard, we need to check that checkbox there at the bottom to allow for that functionality. We also have our AAI set up. This is in the P0012. Our top AAI is there. That's the setup to create the journal entry for operating leases. And then the bottom set of AAIs is to create our journal entry for our financing leases. And these entries take place when the user runs the R15 180. Then we get into our bill codes, and this really drives the system and drives the creation of our amortization schedules. So these bill codes can be found in the P1502 application, and these indicate the monthly billing rate of the lease. And also, if you noticed in there, we have our gross amount, which is the payment amount, and then we have our billing frequency, which is how often we want the billing to take place. So in this case, it would be monthly. And then a very important field on this grid is this effect on lease liability checkbox. And this needs to be checked in order to create our amortization schedules. Then we would need to create our lessee and lessor address book records. This is your typical address book setup, so nothing fancy here. But also be sure to set up a supplier and the customer master record whenever you set up the lessee or lessor, whichever is required. Then we would need to create our asset. This is done in the P1204 application, and these can be set up manually through the asset master, as you see on the screen here. Or it can also be generated when adding a new unit, but that's only if you set it up to do so through processing options. Then we create our unit. This is done through the P15217 application. And as you can see here, we have our building number, which is a business unit. And then we have our unit number there as well. And then we would enter in that asset number that we created for the unit. And then we would also need to put in this unit type for which type of unit it is. And then we also have some grid information down below if we want to specify any more detail about the unit. Then we go into creating our lease in the P1501 application. This is where the lease is set up, and all of our previous information goes into this lease. So that includes our tenant, our building, our unit, and then we can also identify the terms of the lease here as well. There's also an important tab on here when you're creating the lease, and that is this Lessee Accounting tab. This is where you can default a lease classification into the grid detail. This is also where you specify the borrowing rate for the lease, and then if you're also reasonably certain to exercise the purchase option of the asset once the lease is finished. And then off to the very right in our grid, we have this lease liability status. And this status basically drives us through this entire lease process, all the way from creating the lease through the lease commencement. So we really need to pay attention to that lease liability status and make sure that it's at the right status so we're able to effectively go through the lease creation process. Then we have our amortization schedules. So this is created through those billings and bill codes that we previously discussed. As you see here, we have our lease asset number, unit number, building number, and then we also have this amortization schedule type, which we can toggle between the lease liability and the right of use asset. So if we look into the grid here, we can tell, if our journal exists for those lease, if there are journal entries against it, and which lines have those journals, when it begins, some balances, and what are basically our monthly journal entries are going to be when we create those. And then this is just the other side of that, where we see our right of use asset values. So once again, we have our beginning dates and our ending dates, and then we have our interest expenses, right of use, asset expenses, and then the reduction amount with our ending balance. For lease commencement, this is done through the R15-170 application. And basically at commencement, this is going to debit our right of use asset account, and it's going to credit our lease liability account. And these are just some of the processing options that allow us some flexibility for the functionality when creating this lease commencement. Then we have our lease entries, which is done through the R15-180 application. And these are when we create those monthly accruals and journal entries that we saw on our schedule, our leasing schedule. So here we see we can process these lease entries through a certain month or through a certain year. We can specify GL dates if we wish to as well. So this provides us just with some extra flexibility when we're going through creating these lease entries and how we want to see them created. Then we have our recurring billing generation, and this is done through the R15-100. And we can see here that we have some additional processing options, once again, to give us some flexibility on how we want these to be created. And this can be done by using different billing dates, billing years, period numbers. So this just gives us some further flexibility there as well. If you want to see a demo, we also have a video for a demo on this process as we take you through the implementation steps, and then we go through how to create the address book, the asset numbers, the lease, how to commence the lease, how to create those journal entries, and then we take you all the way through seeing it in the accounts payable module. So if you want to check that out, please feel free to do so. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to us here at Trillium. Thank you for your time.